Hello and welcome to Off the Roll. I'm your host, Troy Hirschman. Want to welcome everybody to the podcast today, February 15th, the day after Valentine's Day, here in my home studio in the basement. We have a very, very special guest today. Mark Pfeil is joining us, and a lot of people might not know who Mark is, but Mark is a physical therapist who is a longtime athletic trainer for the Chicago Bulls and the Milwaukee Bucks, and practiced physical therapy at a downtown clinic in Chicago with a physician group headed up by Dick Hoover. And Mark was part of that group of Glenn Snow and Dick Hoover, Ron O'Neill, that were starting private physical therapy, starting in the athletic training room at Northwestern University, and then moving on to physician offices and independent clinics across the nation. And Mark was right there, front row and center for a lot of that, but also front row and center for the rise of the Chicago Bulls. He was the athletic trainer Michael Jordan's rookie year through 1990, and then he moved on to the Milwaukee Bucks for 10 years after that. At that point, he kind of retired and is kind of doing his own deal in North Carolina now with his wife, Beth. And so Mark is joining us today to kind of tell some stories and tell his story, most importantly, and it's a great story. So I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to Off the Roll. I'm your host, Troy Hirschman. Today we have a very, very special guest. We have Mark Pfeil and his lovely wife, Beth, with us on the podcast today. Mark was a longtime athletic trainer in the NBA with the Chicago Bulls and the Milwaukee Bucks, as well as a practicing physical therapist, and has a great connection with Dick Hoover and really part of that group of Snowball and Sendre and Ron O'Neill that were in Chicago in the what I would consider the wild west of physical therapy back in the 70s and 80s, maybe into the 90s a little bit, with when private physical therapy was just getting off the ground. So welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So one thing I don't know about you very well is kind of, where are you from? Where's home? Where was home?
A little town in northeast Nebraska called Wausa. Okay. And it's a town of about 500 to 600 people. Wow. Little farming community.
Wow. And so were you involved with any sports or anything there? What kind of,
high school sports. I played basketball, football, and they made us, if we wanted to be in football, they made us, go out for track.
Okay.
So I was one of the little fat guys that would, run and puke on the side of the road.
Well, so from high school, where do you go there then?
I went to the University of Nebraska, and just as in education, physical education major, driver's education, health, that type of, and that's when I ran into George Sullivan. And Paul Snyder was not a PT, but was probably the main trainer at Nebraska at that time. Yeah. And then there was Roger Long, who was at the health center, and he would, help during football season. So George and Roger were both PTs. So that's when I got interested. I don't know if you know Sandy Miller. Sandy is a Hall of Fame trainer.
Yes.
And I think he spent most of his time in the Missouri area.
Right.
They only allowed one student trainer, and Sandy was in most of my classes. So he was the only student trainer Nebraska had.
Yeah. So give me a time frame of when this was.
Well, I started at Nebraska in 67, graduated in 71, and that's when I got into PT school. And Northwestern at that time had the only 16-month program, and it was continuous. So I started in July of 71, graduated in October of 72. Okay.
And so that's like you know, and we're going to kind of rehash this because we were talking a little bit off the recording, but that's where you kind of, was it George Sullivan that kind of got you connected to Dick Hoover? How did that happen?
Well, actually, I didn't. Somebody gave me the name when I was at Northwestern, and they were having a PT meeting in Arlington Heights at the time. So I went out and just took a chance that I might, run into Dick, and I did. And I just introduced myself and asked if he would have any interest in, doing an affiliation with students at Northwestern. And he kind of gave me the background that they were not, real excited about athletic trainers being in their PT programs. But between Elizabeth Wood and Sally Pearson, who became the director the night we graduated, Dick got me the affiliations, and I ended up with a 4-week affiliation during the College All-Stars, and then an 8-week affiliation at Northwestern.
Wow. So were you, you were, I guess, so were you doing some athletic training stuff at Nebraska before you went to Northwestern?
No. Okay. In fact, it was funny. I was like with Ron Sendre, and then Ron Freeman, who was a high school trainer in Forest View. He was the first trainer at District 214 in northern Chicago area. And he would let me come out to the high school, and he was the one that kind of started me. So Ron Freeman, Ron Sendre, myself worked with Ron and Dick at the College All-Star. And it was funny because the Nebraska coaches were the coaches that year for the All-Star game.
Okay.
So again, I knew most of those just because they were instructors in many of my classes, and then because I would go over and just, observe with Sandy and stuff like that.
Yeah. Wow. So again, kind of being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, exactly.
To have those connects and stuff. Okay.
The first day I went up to Dyke Stadium, I was coming, walking down the drive, and I could see a guy laying on the ground. Had no idea, so I kind of ran up to him. Well, it was Hoover, and he was having a kidney stone, and he had a VW Bug at the time, and he said, "You got to help me get in this and drive me to the emergency room." And I hadn't driven a stick shift, other than a tractor.
Yeah.
But I got Dick in the front seat, facing into the back seat on his knees, and I got around and I chugged along until we got onto the road, and he showed me how to get to Evanston Hospital, and I dropped him off, and he told me just go on back that Ron O'Neill would be there. So pretty soon they all showed up, and about 2 weeks later, Sendre had a kidney stone. So it was. I'm thinking, my gosh, I don't know if I want to hang around this place if we get kidney stones. But that's actually the first time I got to, really meet and sit down with Dick.
Yeah. you had him captive, and he wasn't going anywhere with a kidney stone. So
yeah. And of course he yelled at me with my driving the whole way to the hospital. So
well, it certainly would not be the last time that Dick yelled at anybody for anything. So
after working for him for a number of years with his clinic in Chicago, I found that out.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell me about, so I'm going to kind of set up the College All-Stars a little bit. At one time, obviously, the seniors that were graduating from college that year would play the NFL champion, correct?
Right.
Or the Chicago Bears or whatever.
Yes.
It obviously had gone on for a long time. I tried to do some research on it over the weekend. I really can't find any team photos on the internet or anything. But so how long were you doing the College All-Star game with those guys?
Well, just the July of 71.
Okay.
And that was an affiliation for me. And then I had a hospital affiliation between that. And then in September, went back with Dick and Ron with Northwestern.
Right.
But it was, it was an intense because we had players from all over the country, and we were playing the Dolphins, if I remember right. They had done their undefeated season that year.
Yeah.
And that's and I know we got beat, but I don't remember, much of the game. It was, we were given assignments, basically kind of stay out of the way.
Right.
Assignments, but
right.
It was an eye-opening for me just to see, the amount of work that the trainers actually do on the side, watching each play. Somebody always checking people that came off the field and those kinds of things. So, Ron Sendre and Freeman and O'Neill naturally had experience. So, I would just kind of observe and follow, do what they were doing, and it was more kind of a gopher during those times, through that month. So
yeah. So you finish up at Northwestern in 16 months, and so did physical therapy have a board exam to sit through at that point in time?
Yeah, and it was funny because I went back to Nebraska, and about a week after I got back to Nebraska, I had to go to Lincoln to take my exam, and I was the only one taking the exam that year, and George Sullivan was my proctor for the exam. So we talked. I took the exam, and he said, I'd like to go ahead and skip the physical part of it. We had a practical as well, but he said, let's go ahead and I'll throw some things out to you, because it was mandatory. So if I'd have gone to any other state, then I had to do it, years after I went through. So he gave me my practical, and I ended up setting my own practice up in Nebraska. Little rural area, I had 7 hospitals and 13 nursing homes.
Oh my goodness.
And it was, probably my biggest hospital was 35 beds. Biggest nursing home was probably 80. So I would travel to each of the nursing home once a month, and they all hired one person that would work with me, and the doctors would order, if there were strokes, hip fractures, whatever. But it was fun, Troy, because over the 4 years I was in that area, we had no bed patients. I showed the gals how to lift properly. Everybody was given a shower. Nobody had bed baths.
Right.
And they had activity rooms, and the people found that it was a whole lot easier taking care, of those types of patients in that situation. So I enjoyed it. I had about 3 physicians at most of the hospital, that they were grouped. So if you had a key hospital, you might have 2 docs from other hospitals feeding into that one. And I had 3 or 4 main hospitals, as I would travel around. And I would see those 2 to 3 days a week. And they all set a couple treatment tables up in their emergency rooms. So I would set them. And you'd get a kick out of this, Troy. I got called in by the hospital board. I charged $7, $10, and $12 for treatments, depending on what I did and how long I spent.
Right.
And they wanted me to drop my prices because I was more expensive than the physician's charge in the emergency room, which was $6. And I told him I wasn't going to change my pricing, but that I would try to charge more $7 charges than 10 or 12.
Yeah.
So, but that it does. That's been 50 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, they would, I think if there were any hospital administrators that would listen to this today would probably go, I'll hire you right now. Keep your price the same. We'll hire you right now.
It was funny too. What I did is I told them that they would do the billing for me, and I gave them 25%, but they had to collect.
Yeah.
And it was funny. So I would just give them a bill with, hour of the patients treated. And during that time, there was really, and we were all Joint Commission approved hospitals. You didn't have to write it. All you had to do is put physical therapy given or physical therapy ordered for strengthening, whatever. And that was all you had. You didn't have to do all kinds of notations and stuff like that.
There was no CPT coding or any of that. Oh my
gosh, nothing. It just, and I put the $7 for exercise or $10 for exercise and ultrasound, whatever. And it was funny, after 4 years, all 7 hospitals combined had less than $300 on their collection. That's all they had to collect to have 100% collection. So it worked out good. That was a fun time.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that athletic training's out there trying to do third-party billing and all this stuff, and there's a few guys out there that are doing a kind of a cash basis type thing, or they have, I know Tony Cox is doing injury cards where at the hospital he works at that they have like a sports medicine type area with athletic trainers and stuff, and kids can pay $35 or $40 for these cards and they get like 10 treatments on them or something. It's $10 a treatment, not like what you did 50 years ago. And there's people out there that says, oh, the bigwigs in athletic training say that'll never work. And yeah, it's going to take a lot of volume, but you can still take care of a lot of patients by offering them an economical way of doing things. And they could probably charge more and still get that type of level of reimbursement through that. But it worked a long time ago. And things are different. I get it. But I think a cash-based payment plan for healthcare is not out of the realm of possibility, especially for a group like us who is probably not going to get reimbursed by Medicare, Medicaid, at least maybe not in my career. And you have to find a way, basically.
Yeah. So. It's funny though, Troy, in this area, and this started about the time I quit in 2009, most of your chiropractors went to cash.
Really?
And they dropped their charges a little bit because everybody was afraid. And they would do the same thing. They would say, for $300, I'll give you 10 treatments and a set of x-ray, blah, blah, blah. And they found out they made about 30% more cash than they did when they were, billing insurance companies. So, if you have the, kind of the background and the stay with attitude that, the first few months are probably going to be tough. A lot of times those kinds of things work. But I had, in addition to that, I would work, it was called the NENAC. It was the Northeast Nebraska Athletic Conference. So we had 9 high schools, and I would cover, Neely was the place where I lived. So I would cover all of their home games. And then when they didn't have a home game, I would go to, some of the other schools. And it was funny. My head physician was also the surgeon. And he said football was the worst thing you could imagine.
Yeah.
So, and he would fly to various hospitals, and both of us ended up at a hospital. He was in surgery and got a phone call that a person had ruptured their spleen.
Okay.
And he looks at me and he says, "Hey, goddamn football." He said, "You want to come with me? Because I'll probably have to take the spleen out." We got up there, and what had happened is a tuba player had fallen down the stairs and landed on his horn. So I said, they ought to do away with band. But that was he was a great guy. He actually got me interested, so I got my pilot's license. So
wow,
two or three different occasions I would fly, land in a little alfalfa field. The maintenance man would come out and pick me up. But my wife didn't think my flying, was a good idea. So.
Well, I get, Nebraska is a big state. You got to get from one place to another quickly. So
that's exactly right. But, I always had the interest in getting back to Chicago, and I would stay in touch with Dick, but at that time he had a private practice in Des Plaines, but I went back and I worked with a classmate of mine in Skokie, and we had a home practice, where we'd go out to people's homes, nursing homes, but then we had an outpatient orthopedic practice. So I worked with him a year, and that's when Dick started the office downtown with the Bulls physicians. And that's how he hired me to run that office. And it was funny, Troy, Steve Douglas was in charge and ran the Des Plaines office. Well, after a couple of years, I left to go with, I think I was with Dick maybe 3 years, because in 1980, I applied and I had already, rehabbed Jerry Sloan, Tom Borwinkle. So I was familiar with the docs downstairs, but I was familiar with the GM and stuff. And Doug Atkinson went with Dick Mata to Dallas. Okay. So that left the position open, and I interviewed with Jerry and Phil, his assistant, and then Rod Thorne. But that's how I ended up with Chicago Bulls. Yeah. And when I left Dick, Steve left Dick to go to dental schools. And 4 years later, I hired Steve as our team dentist. So, we stuck together good.
Yeah. I think it's so you were there. So when did you go back to Chicago then? So
76.
The 76.
So I was from 72 to 76. Then I went back from 76 to 77. I worked with Paul Smith. And then in 77, I joined Dick and worked with him until actually July 1st of 1980.
Yeah. I mean, that era that you're kind of talking about, that clinic was, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, they were not only taking care of the Bulls, but the Cubs, the White Sox. I mean, they were.
That's it. We ended up doing a lot of the rehab, and that's how I actually got to know most, because the trainers, most of them didn't want to do rehab. Yeah. So, Tony Garofalo was with the Cubs. Skip Thayer was with the Blackhawks. Gosh, I can't even think of the White Sox. Herm Snyder was with the White Sox. So those guys would just, if they were going to be in town, they would throw players to us, and we'd always get them when they left town, and if they weren't traveling. Yeah. And so we got to know all the trainers and stuff of the pro leagues. And of course, at that time, Dick had Tom Fagan, who worked with Ron and Otho in Philly as one of their assistants. Yeah. Tom came back and Dick hired him as a trainer because they had the Chicago Sting, which was a soccer team at the time. But that was fun. I listened to Ron's yesterday, and when he was talking to all the students, I have to laugh because that year that the office started there, I had my first student, which was Pepper Burris.
Oh, wow.
And Pepper went back, and I think he was with the Jets as an assistant, and then, of course, took over the Packers. Right. So, Pepper and I were close. And again, that whole connection was through Purdue, Pinky Newell and all that. Yeah. And then, of course, Dick was doing the FATA program, which was the Faculty Athletic Training Program with high school trainers in the Chicago area. He was doing that. So it was a way we got connected to a lot of different people. But I had to laugh listening to, that Tom Fagan, and then my second student was Tom's wife. So they would come through and do their PT affiliations through Dick's clinic that way. But
I mean, you could conceivably, you would be in the clinic and you could have, and I mean, you could have a Bulls athlete, you could have a Cubs athlete, you could have a Blackhawk athlete. They're all in there doing rehab, correct?
Yeah. And it was funny, again, the same thing during that, note taking. You didn't need to write a book on each of the patients. At that time, it was myself and I had a PT assistant. And she would basically do any of the modalities that need to be done. We had a big gym area. So we were running anywhere from 60 to 70 patients a day with just the two of us. Wow. But Dick always taught me, make sure you put your hands on the patients every day, and that you teach them something new that they can, do at home. So I thought it was a fun time, and, it was a complete shock to me after I left to go to the Bulls and then came back and went back into PT. They said, you got to spend this amount of minutes and you got to write this kind of a note. And I said, for why? So it was a real shock to come back after being gone for 20 years.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about starting with the Bulls. I mean, definitely a different lifestyle from being in the clinic. I mean, you're now traveling, you're that first year, kind of at some point in time, did you go, what am I doing? Then did you come to some point where you're like, how did I get here? I'm a farm boy from Nebraska. How did I end up here? Because I know I've asked that question when I was working in Philadelphia as an intern. I'm like, how did I get here?
Well, what was funny is a farm boy from Illinois called Jerry Sloan was the one that hired me. So that helped a lot. You get a kick when I was interviewing. Jerry and Rod Thorne looked at me and they said, our only hesitancy to hire you is you don't have any work with minorities. And I said, but I do. And he said, well, what minorities did you have in a little town in Northeast Nebraska? I said, Catholics and Democrats. And they both, he said, I think he'll be able to handle the minorities. So I got the job in basketball. I enjoyed listening to Ron because they were strictly, football with all the athletes they had. In basketball at that time, we were the traveling secretary, equipment man, everything. You right. Just, if it went through the Bulls, I probably had touched it some way. We did all the hotels, all the travel. I ordered all the tape and practice gear, all that kind of stuff. So, you took probably more time doing that kind of stuff than anything else. So,
right.
But, I think, Jerry was such an easy guy to work with that it was easy. And of course, Hoover would come over to the practice site and he knew Jerry. And because again, just through the clinics with Borwinkle and Sloan being rehab. So, and again, he'd point out different things. And we didn't have a very, we were at Angel Guardian, which was an orphanage type situation for mentally, the challenged kids, cerebral palsy,
right.
Every kind of dysfunction you could think of. We had a nice swimming pool there. So, it wasn't a bad situation, but we were on a floor that was right over cement. So you had a lot of, tendinitis, hip, knees, backs, right. That kind of thing. So we were always we were glad when we moved to the multiplex in Northbrook, which, we were able to put down the floating floor and have our own facility, weight rooms and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That, you were obviously there with the Bulls in that transition of from where they were in the early 80s to, like you just talked about, the move to the multiplex, but in a lot of ways that team was transitioning to the legendary teams of the 90s while you were there. I mean,
yeah.
What did you see that was making the biggest difference in that transition?
Well, number one, Michael Jordan. I had Michael his first 6 years, so from 84 to 90. And, his attitude about winning, he absolutely, I think if Michael hadn't have been there, Scotty and Horace would have never been the players they were. And right. Of course, guys like, John Paxson, Craig Hodges, having somebody like Michael that everybody would flock to, all they had to do is make sure they could hit their threes. So it eventually, it was funny with Chicago, I went through 7 coaches in 10 years. And each time the coach got fired, I got fired. And I would just kind of hide out in the training room until practice started the next year. And they go, we forgot to hire a trainer. We'll just keep Mark. So I didn't have worries with that. And then when I went to Milwaukee, I had 5 coaches in 10 years there. So I had 12 coaches in 20 years. So it was a real challenge. But I can't think of a coach that, in some ways there was, good about each one that we had. Of course, Jerry was probably my favorite, with Stan Albeck and Doug Collins, right behind them. But it was a lot of fun times too.
What did you see, and I've talked about this a little bit with Ron and Snowball and even one of our team musicians, Alan Habansky, who was in Muncie kind of the same time you were starting your physical therapy practice and then moved to the Bulls. But that time between 1975 and 1990, there was a lot of change medically going on. I mean, you go from from the surgeries and the rehabs and all that stuff. I mean, what was some of the biggest challenges for you as an athlete trainer, PT in the NBA, trying to take all that stuff on?
Well, I was again fortunate to be around the number of physicians in Chicago just through my clinic years with Dick. So I saw that transitioning in the clinic before, I actually they used to do a big S opening for meniscus. And then all of a sudden here comes the scope,
right,
and things like that. So your rehab went from 10 days to maybe 2 days on, right, getting those guys back on the floor. And then we would find that if we pushed them too soon, then you'd have to sit them down again because you start to have to control the swelling. So we might, push it to 2 weeks. If you had a surgery done, you'd maybe just tell them they'd be out 2 weeks. Yeah. But I was fortunate to not have a lot of players miss games until when I got to Milwaukee, it was a whole different attitude. If they were hurt, they didn't have to play or practice. So that was frustrating somewhat to me as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that, even in just the technology was, and I was a student in high school back then in the mid 80s, but I mean, even then some of that stuff was changing so fast that I can't see how, it's not like today. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that comes out today, but just the fact that you're going from, like you said, casting people up for ACL surgery to no, let's not cast them anymore. Let's get them moving. Let's work on range of motion. Let's get them weight bearing, all that stuff. I mean, that's a pretty drastic shift to to try to process in a short period of time.
Yeah. And I had, with the Bulls, I had, and I'm trying to think, I think it was actually the Bucks. I had Danny Manning, and he had just had an ACL. So we rehabbed him, got him back. And then towards the end of that first year with the Bucks, he tore his other ACL.
Yeah.
So then we rehabbed him for the year he came back. And that next year he tore his first one again. So he ended up with 3 ACLs and still came back and played. But, again, I think it was a lesson that even though they were functional, feeling good, I always kind of had the attitude that even at a year, the ACL was probably 85% the strength of the normal ones. So, there was just a lot of times you had the pressure to kind of push, but if we would just step back, they'd come back and then they wouldn't miss anymore.
Yeah.
So it was fun. It was always the physician and I that got to make the determination, does a player play or not? So, and the player.
Yeah. One of the things that I talked about with Ron a little bit, which I think was, he had talked about trying to find your niche, so to speak, but were you kind of on the ground floor too with all the isokinetic strengthening stuff too with KenCom and all that stuff?
Yeah. Especially with Dick. Bernie Zelhoff was the big pusher of Cybex. I think he was the main salesman and so I think Dick was probably the first office in Chicago that had any Cybex.
Okay.
And, again, I always get a kick that Dick was always in the wheeling and dealing. Well, then we were rehabbing a postal employee that got hit by a mail truck.
Okay.
And, we got sued. And basically it was Cybex that was being sued because I reported, her case in court that I couldn't find any weakness in her leg and that she was, functionally fine to return to work. And we had private investigator, had her throwing frisbees in the park and running around. But of course, the day I was supposed to testify, it was Hoover that was supposed to testify, and he calls, I'm stuck in a meeting, you go ahead and go to court. I was scared to death. And when the attorney, he got all done questioning me, he looks at me and says, not exactly like Perry Mason, was it? But she had sued for over $1 million and ended up getting $100,000. So the post office felt that because of the Cybex, you couldn't cheat on a Cybex. The curves, right. You couldn't duplicate a curve, if you weren't given 100%. So
right, yeah.
But that was there, and one of the things that I had an advantage was I thought of my rehab at Northwestern. Dorothy Voss and Maggie Knott were the ones that kind of devised PNF. And of course, Maggie was real wide, Dorothy was narrow. And I had Dorothy for, 26 weeks. We had 6 hours a week for 26 weeks of PNF. So I felt really, really good. And I tell you, it served me well. Yeah. And that was one of the things when Ron was trying to teach me how to tape ankles during the All-Star. He was asking me questions about PNF and stuff like that. So it was fun to, do that. Just 2 or 3 of us sitting in there, working on that type of stuff.
That's interesting. Neal, you can chime in on this, but we got Neal Hazen on the podcast with us today too, as just kind of an observer. But when do you think, Neal, was the last time you saw PNF taught in an athletic training class?
That's a good question.
Yeah, probably, and everybody thinks PNF is just, they don't even know it's the diagonals, the two patterns that are what, plus the contract, relax, hold, everything that goes with it. But it was to be done in those patterns so you could use the strong muscles to help the weak. Right. And I used it, again, basically with upper and lower extremities. But if you would do patterns with, rotation of the spine, head and neck, those kinds of things, it saved me in so many instances. Yeah. But it wasn't until I was with the Bucks, which started in '90, that I got a call from Dave Pearson, who was a partial strength coach and human performance there. Yeah. And he wanted to know if I had ever heard of Graztec Tools. So he got me in touch with Dave Graston. Yeah. And he came up, and then he brought me down to Ball State, and we actually talked, I think, to an athletic training class. And there were some physicians there and everything. And that's how I got to know, Dave. Is he still around?
I think he's retired.
Okay.
So I think he
retired.
Around. Yeah.
He retired when he came to Ball State.
I haven't seen him for a little while now, but yes, I think Troy's correct. I think he's taking another step towards retirement, at least.
Well, if you tell him retirement is great. we love what we're doing here. Yeah. But I wished I'd have done it sooner, but there's a lot of things that I don't know how I had time to work with all the things we're doing in retirement.
Yeah. Yeah. So what was some of the more memorable things that you remember in your time with the Bulls? I mean, it could be anything. It could be, but and then we'll move on from there a little bit. But yeah, what was some more? I mean, that was like I said, that was a big transition period.
Yeah. The one injury I had with Rod Higgins, and it was so funny because Kent Falb at one of the PT meetings, he said, regardless of what you think, always be prepared to handle cervical injuries. So we would practice it. All I had was my equipment man, but we would, get the spine board, somebody would lay down, we'd practice on that. But one night, Rod Higgins was going down the floor, was going up for a layup, and somebody cut his legs off, and he fell, hit his head on the floor, and then a teammate, Wallace Bryant was his name, and he was a 7-foot, 300-pound. He landed with his hip on Rod's head again, and Rod immediately went into almost a paraplegic with one arm clenched and stuff in the air, and was convulsing. And both Mike Saunders, this was at the Garden, Mike Saunders and I got to him, and Dr. Scott came out right away, and we stabilized, got an airway in him and everything. And the thing that frustrated me is they actually, on ESPN, they said he died on the way to the hospital. And when I come back, I just had called Rod Thorne and told him everything. Rod was awake and, remembered everything, and that he'd spend the night in the hospital, and then I'd send him back to Chicago. So, but that was frustrating because then I had to go back and on ESPN at least let his parents know that Rod was fine, and there had been some miscommunication somewhere. Yeah. But I think one of the other, was just the rules and regulations. Certain coaches, Doug Collins, I mean, he hated people that were late. He always told me, you lock the door at 10 o'clock and then we'll fine them, $5,000 for being late to practice. And then if a lot of times the door was locked, they just leave. So then Doug would add on a meeting so we could find him another 5,000 bucks. But I was taping ankles one day, and Scottie Pippen calls and said, I'm not coming into practice today. And I said, well, are you sick? He goes, no. He said, my cat died. And I said, okay. And I said, did you call the coaches? He said, no, you go tell the coaches. Oh, so I went over, and Johnny Bach and Doug just were going nuts. And they were saying, you get on the phone, tell Scotty, get in here. We're going to find him big time. Well, as I walked back to the training room, the phone's ringing, and it was Horace Grant. And Horace said, I'm not going to be coming in today. And I said, are you sick? And he goes, no, I'm going to Scotty's cat's funeral. So it was just, and we ended up getting $10,000 from each of them for that little escapade. But those are the kinds of things you'd run into all the time.
Did his cat really die? Or was this?
He really did. And when Johnny Bach caught him, he said, when you find a dead cat, you throw it in the garbage can. Well, of course, those guys were just beside themselves. Of course, Michael was over in a corner just laughing himself sick. But those are the things we run into from all the time. The time.
I mean, in all my years, I mean, I heard all sorts of excuses. You know, I had one kid tell me that he all four tires of his car went flat at the same time. I mean, you know, I couldn't make it in for treatment because I lost the keys to my apartment, and I only had the clothes I wore to the bar last night. I mean, just all sorts of stuff. You know, we've all heard it, but I don't think I've ever heard that my cat died.
Well, and I think the other thing that just after Michael got there, I mean, everything changed from our valuable bag that I always had to take care of during the games and everything. But we were, you know, Michael was a rookie. We were headed for our first West Coast trip. So I probably had 100 some bags on the flight. And I saw Michael give $50 when the plane landed. He gave $50 to one of the, you know, skycap type guys that came on board and shook his hand. And I told him, I said, Michael, I take care of all the tips. You don't have to worry about that. And he goes, shh. He said, watch this. So we walked down. I got a skycap to start collecting the bags as they came off the carousel, and the bell rang. The doors opened up, and Michael announces, I'll bet everybody $100 that my bags are first off on the luggage. And everybody, including the coaches, he had like $2,200 laying there on the ground. And of course, here come his two Louis Vuitton bags off. He picks up the $2,200 and looks at me and says, not a bad return on my 50. And he did that several times. And he goes, don't tell my pigeons what I'm doing. But we just had things like that all the time with him.
Wow. Yeah, that's there definitely is shenanigans on the road. It's certainly not at the same level at the college level that I saw that definitely that you did, because I don't think nowadays college kids might have $50 to pull that off, but you know, they're certainly not at Ball State, but you know, that's the thing that kind of made it fun, you know, to do those things and have those opportunities and you know, the story, I'm trying to think of some stories that I had, but it's gosh, sometimes it all runs together, probably just like for you. I mean, so anyway, so in 1990 you leave the Bulls and you take a job with the Bucks. What was the story on that?
Well, basically, Jerry Krause would not give contracts to assistant coaches and trainers. You know, they had, you know, a handshake. It wasn't right. You know, they agreed on a salary and stuff like that. And Jeff Snedeker had passed away. He, you know, was the Jets trainer, the Cosmos trainer, and then the Bucks trainer. He died of esophageal cancer. And let's see, Del Harris was the coach.
Yeah.
And he called me, and I was actually the trainer that would do the pre-draft physical. So we bring in 88 guys, and I did that for 19 years. So you got to know all the coaches, all the team physicians, and a lot of the people in the NBA as well. And of course, my first GM, Rod Thorne, had gone to the NBA office. So it was one of those things where Del called me and said, "Would you be interested?" And he said, "We'll give you a 3-year contract." It was like, whoa.
Yeah.
I'll be right up. But what I did is I called Michael, and he said, "Well, let me call Reinsdorf, because I don't want you to go up there."
Right.
And I told him, I said, "Michael, I'll give you," Monday was the 4th of July. So I said, "I need to hear something by Tuesday." And I called Michael Tuesday night, and I said, nobody called. So I took the job in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
And I was there for 10 years as well. So, and again, started out with a lot of we had Jack Sikma, but then we picked up Moses Malone. And like I said, Danny Manning came up, and we had a pretty good Alvin Robertson, a lot of pretty good guys. So, but we didn't win. They had never missed the playoffs until I got there, and then we missed for 7 of my 10 years. So I might have been the bad luck charm.
No, I mean, you wonder that sometimes, but there's obviously, there's a lot of other factors that go into that, and we've all done our very best to keep people healthy, but if the players on the other team are better than the players that you have, and they're still, your team's healthy and they're a little dinged up and they can still beat you, it's not you. It's not you.
But now I tell you, it's been like from meeting Dick, to all the networking he did for you, to meet, Pinky, Otho, right on down. You get, so like Larry Gardner with the Dallas Cowboys at that time, they were doing in the summertime, they would do car races, and it was, the Indy cars, but I can't remember what, a cart, CART at that time.
Yeah.
And we would, Justin Boots would have a great big camper that had 2 emergency rooms, and in the back a PT area. So we would do, therapy for all the drivers and stuff like that. And I did the Chicago race, and then Elkhorn up in, it was kind of not the Indy racing, but the race courses like you see over in Europe. We like would do that.
Like a road course.
Road course.
Elkhart Lake is the one in Wisconsin there.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
But I would do about 3, and then we had the big one in Milwaukee. So I do about 3 races. But if I hadn't known Larry and I just went blank. Who was Fullerton, California? Chambers.
Bill Chambers.
Yeah, Chambers was out. He was one of those. So what they started doing when they go into the different areas is try to grab NBA guys to, work those races in the summertime. So
yeah, because you run the off season at that point in time.
Yeah.
So who were some of the more famous race car guys that you've worked with?
Well, what was funny is I knew Walter Payton, and he got in to buy a team, and but we had, I think we had most of the ones, because they dropped the Indy 500. I can't remember the names of the race, the race teams and stuff, but AJ, you got to meet all these guys coming through the, coming through. It was fun because they actually had a fire crew and there were about 9 firemen, and they were all paramedics as well, and they'd come in and change their clothes and go out, and it was amazing to watch these guys operate, because, and I didn't realize the fuel is invisible when it's burning, so you could walk up to a car and get caught. But the doctor was from Indy, that was always, his wife was a nurse, and he did most of your cart in Indy 500. Was it Trammell?
Yeah, Terry Trammell. Yeah,
there you go. And it, just sitting on top of the camper, and he could watch if there was somebody says, load them up, and boy, they'd shoot down, and those guys would take off in their pickup. So that was a fun thing to be involved with as well.
Yeah, because in the off season, like, guys would not necessarily be in town, would they?
No, most of them were gone, and we were lucky to get them back in a month before the season.
Lucky.
But however, what they started to do is, as soon as the draft, then we go to California for 6 to 8 weeks,
right,
and have summer league with you'd probably draft 5 or 6 and then pick up free agents, so you'd have 12, 15 players, and then you'd play games at Loyola Marymount for that period of time.
Yeah. Is that how? Because believe it or not, I have a little bit of a connection to Chip Schaefer. So Chip was a Utah guy.
Okay.
He went to University of Utah, was a student under Bill Bean, who was the head trainer at University of Utah at the time. and then obviously was at Loyola Marymount, and then made his way to the Bulls after you. Is that kind of how Chip got there?
Well, and I think a lot of that was Jerry Krause got familiar with him through all the summer leagues. And of course, Chip would, he would always hang around. So if somebody didn't have a team, he and I would take care of those teams together. Yeah. And I think just that familiarity. And then when I left, Chip applied, and he got the job that way. And I think he's back in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken.
He is. Yeah, he is. I only got to talk to him 2 or 3 times when I was in grad school at Utah, when they would come out to play the Jazz and stuff. And Bill would one time they actually practiced in the Huntsman Center. That was the year that Michael was playing baseball. So I didn't get to see him, but I went down there with Bill and we watched practice, and I met Chip and talked to him while he was also, when he was a student, he worked women's gymnastics at Utah, which is what my GA position was. And so the head coach Greg and Megan Marsden would always talk about Chip, and so there was this kind of this 6 degrees of separation type deal with that. Sure. But there's a lot of that in athletic training. I mean, there's just the connects of and somehow Hoove and Ball State and all that stuff is part of that 6 degrees of separation with that. Yeah. And that's really why I wanted to have you on the podcast, was because you're part of that. You're kind of connected to all of us with that, and because of Hoove, and then you throw in O'Neal and Sendre and even Otho a little bit, with that, and it's kind of strange how it all kind of just connects. So,
well, it's funny when you bring Otho up. Hoover rented a camper, and they were playing in St. Louis. So he took Fagan and myself and Steve Douglas, and I can't remember if there was anybody else. And we took the camper and went down to see the Eagles play somebody. And we met, Otho, for dinner that night. And we went out.
Who didn't like to fly, did he?
No, he didn't. He hated it. I'll tell you a quick story about that as well. But we went to a Mexican restaurant. And I'm telling you, Otho just kept feeding us and feeding us and feeding us, and well as drinking. And I got mixed up, got into the wrong bathroom and everything. But then Hoover told Otho, I got to get this guy back, get back to the hotel. And Hoover and I were sharing a room, and I looked out. We were probably 12, 13 stories up. And I said, Hoove, I don't think it was that cold outside, but it looks like the swimming pool is frozen. Well, hell, it was the tarp on the swimming pool.
Yeah.
And who says, get into bed? He said, turn towards the bathroom. He said, don't you dare throw up on the floor. And then Otho calls early in the morning. He says, we're down here taping ankles. I thought you were coming down. And he said, make sure when you come down, eat ice cream. And I'm going, eat ice cream. So as we're sitting there having breakfast, he told you always want to eat ice cream, because the first time you go to the bathroom, you can always say, come on, ice cream. And I tell you, that whole day, stand there on the sideline watching those guys was amazing. But Hoover always made fun of me the way I dressed. Farm kid, hell, I didn't, what matched and what didn't. So he set me up with a men's store in Arlington Heights called Svoboda's. And he said, just tell him Hoover sent you. So I go over, and what he's doing is he's taking Steve Douglas and I to a Cosmos game and then going down to Philly. And so he said, put a sport coat on and everything. So as I go, but we had played racquetball the day before, and I had sprained an ankle, and Hoover knew I had sprained an ankle. He says, I don't think it looks bad. Well, it swelled up so much that night, but I went and I picked up all my clothes, and here I come meeting Hoover in the airport. I'm coming in one door, he's coming in the other, and we are dressed like twins. I've got the same shirt, tie, and sport coat on, but the bad thing is I'm limping because of my ankle, and he thought I was making fun of his polio. And he goes, don't ever make fun of my polio. I said, Hoove, and I showed him my ankle. Well, then we were both laughing as there we go, looking like the Bobbsey twins going down the airport. But I tell you, just one thing after another with him some days.
Oh yeah, that's the thing. I mean, Neal's experienced it. I mean, Snowball told me stories. Just the fact that that he drove everywhere. That was the thing that, like, he goes. Snowball said, no, Troy, he would jump in his car in Chicago and he would drive all the way out to California like it was nothing. Like it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want to fly out there. Yeah. Or Phoenix or wherever. Yeah.
He hated flying, just absolutely hated it. But you'll have to ask, Ron actually took me to my very first interview. He had just gotten, I can't even think of what kind of car. He had a little orange sports car. And a guy up in Cable, Wisconsin, in Haywood, Wisconsin, where all the lumber games are played.
Yeah.
He had a daughter that had an ACL and she was a skier. And Hoover said, I'll send somebody up to take a look at her. Well, I had just graduated and O'Neill so we went up to Haywood and Cable, Wisconsin, probably even smaller than Wausa, and cold that night. So we interviewed up there, and I said, there's no way I'm going to, come up here for this one patient and then, sit there with nothing to do. So I never took that. But you'll have to, next time you talk to O'Neill, tell him that I brought that up. But
yeah,
well, he also, go ahead.
No, you're fine.
Well, he had at Northwestern practices, Ron always had would pick up the water jugs in a golf cart. Well, one time he was busy at it. I can't remember if so Hoover said, send Pfeil with the golf cart. So I picked up all the water stuff and I unloaded them. I nobody ever said where to put the golf cart. Well, here comes Hoover's like a raging bull. He comes into the training room. He says, where's the golf cart? And I said, should be right there in front. He says, no, the neighborhood kids have it in the vacant lot and they're driving. And he told me to go get it. Well, O'Neill says, no, I'll go get the golf cart. I thought, my gosh, I'll never get to touch that golf cart again. So, but it's just been, 50 years of laughs. And you know, the last couple of years where I talked to Dick twice a week, wherever we were. And it would be, he could be complaining, by the time we got done, we were laughing about something. So I still, keep in touch with his wife. So Dickerson was another one. You just laugh every time you see him. We love that guy.
No, but, Jim is another special. The story with me and Jim was that I'm a scared high school. Between my 8th grade and freshman year, I ended up at a Kramer camp at Eastern Kentucky with Bobby Barton and stuff, and Jim's running the camp, and I think it's 1983, and I was the youngest kid there, and there was all sorts of shenanigans going on. Like one night they got some kid and they stripped him down to his underwear and taped him up in a chair and set him in the hallway, and fortunately for me, I think, Jim and I were from the same area, and I think Jim had told my mom and dad that, don't worry, I'll take care of him. And I had nothing ever happened to me that whole week. And I had such a great experience. And then that's kind of what led me to into the profession. And I told him later about that story, and he goes, "You're damn right. I told him not to touch you." He goes, I was going to give you back to your mom and dad crying with your tail between your legs going back home. That wasn't going to happen. So he goes, it really didn't matter whether you had a good experience or not. I just wasn't going to have mom and dad pick you up like that. And
when you mention the Kramer camps, I graduated in 72, and then I married Beth in May of 73. So for our wedding, our honeymoon, I took her to the trainers convention in Kansas City.
and you stayed married for almost 50 years.
It'll be 50 years in May.
Wow.
But it was so funny because we went to the Crown Plaza where the trainers convention was supposed to be, and we had a steak dinner, and when I got the bill for the steak dinner, I couldn't believe what they charged us, and I paid for it, and I left a tip, and we were at a smaller hotel down the road, so we went down to get in our car, and they told me it was like $4.20 or something like that, and I said, well, just a minute. Boy, I jumped on the elevator, went to the top of the hotel for the restaurant, and just as the waiter was there, I had to reach out and I grabbed my tip, and I said I needed to pay for my parking. Well, we ended up calling Hoover for him because they were in Gardner at the time.
Yeah.
So then he bought us a few meals to get me through. But that's when Hank Stram was they had the big old convention that night, and that's what Hank Stram. So she got to hear Hank Stram on her anniversary.
It's not the first time I've heard. We spent our honeymoon at a convention, or the family vacation was at a convention, or any of those things. But there's also legendary stories of all sorts of shenanigans that go on at convention, and usually Otho and Hoover were probably in those stories some way, shape, or form at a convention.
Yeah. But that's why I said it's to be able to have had contact with those people, all the big names that at least you could, speak to them, sit and talk. And I think that was one of my highlights of the trainers meetings is, to sit. And Dick said, you don't know how much it means. And that was after he was in the Hall of Fame, to spend that 20 minutes to a half an hour with the old timers listening to, stories and stuff like that. And then you'd run into them. That's how you got to meet a lot of the people of the booths, that own the products and stuff like that. So it was kind of what I call a storybook career that I'm glad I had the opportunity to be in this profession.
Yeah. And 20 years in the NBA is I know that I'm good friends with David Craig, and I talked to David a little bit about that, and David says we were so busy sometimes you just didn't think of it as a job. You came in and did your stuff. You sometimes you're going from game to game to game, and then it's the end of the season, the playoffs are over with or whatever, and then you, like you said, you hung around long enough to get hired on the next year to do that. But
yeah, hide.
Yeah, but that's the thing, is that he goes, before I knew it, I had 35 years in, and that he goes, then it's like, well, what do I do now? And he's got, I told him, I said, I want to do what you do in retirement. He goes around and kind of has his own business and helps out high school kids and stuff. In fact, he's coming over whenever they get back from Florida. He's going to come over to this little high school I'm working at now and help, kind of show me some stuff with these voodoo bands or whatever. And stuff that he does, but he just loves doing that stuff. And I said, that's cool. That's what I would love to do when I retire. So,
well, and it's so funny, when I quit on July 9th, which happened to be Beth's birthday, but I told her, since I'm the boss, she had to work another 2 weeks so I can say I retired first. So, but it was amazing, because as soon as we got done, it's like, what do you do now? And gosh, we started volunteering at food banks. I was a firefighter for 13 years.
Wow.
And I think that's what one night I figured, she's sleeping with my insurance under her pillow, probably is saying, you're really stupid at 60 years old to become a firefighter. But I did that for 13 years and, had the experience of, you talk about a team, real teamwork, but we did that. Like I told you, on a cook team that I go up three days a month with homeless vets, and now they opened a new facility with battered women and children, and they're homeless, they're drug addicted, things like that. So it's fun doing those kinds of things. So
Snowball said maybe you might have to do a joint venture with him. That's what he does. His church does, they go out and cook meals and mostly shut-ins and older folks in the community and stuff, and he loves it. That's the thing. That's his kind of his passion right now, is to get together and do that.
There's 800 churches around Asheville that support this. There's no government money at all, and it's one of 3 facilities that it's a 2-year program, and they get them off their addiction, they get them educated, find them jobs, and most of the time they get them back with families into a faith. So it's fun to be part of that and sit and talk. During COVID, we were cooking, and I had a veteran from Afghanistan. He had lost part of his one arm and his leg, and we've got our masks on and everything, and he doesn't have a mask, and he's laughing, he's cooking, doing the dishes. And he said, I can't believe you guys are scared of a virus. And I kind of laughed, and I said, well, nobody knows anything about it. And he said, no, but he said, if you want to be scared, he said, spend a night on the street with me. He's been on the street for 5 years.
Yeah.
He said, I fight in a war that nobody knows what we're over there. Our commanding officers are selling drugs to us from the tribal leaders. We get addicted, and then they kick us out and send us home with no support. And he said, you ought to get in the dumpster with me and look for food that you'll be able to eat at night. There's usually about 4 of us in a dumpster. And he said, we'll spend 4 or 5 hours and we fill our pockets full of food to eat. And he said, then we get out, and it's time to find a place on the street. And then after dark, you lay down trying to keep warm, but the rats are crawling all over you trying to get the food out of your pockets.
Oh my
And
God.
I am just going nuts. And I said, I think you're right. I don't know if I'm going to be scared of this virus anymore.
Right. Yeah.
So it is just, it's amazing some of the things that we see.
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely have a tremendous perspective on life in general, just from that, because I mean, you've seen all the excess, and then you have a conversation like that and you're like,
yeah,
wow. I mean, it's we got a lot to be thankful for, and
oh boy,
and you're just doing your best to pay it back, basically.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I told Beth, I said, while we're still healthy, we need to get in a facility like we're in. You'll have to tell O'Neal. He said, how old is he? Is he 75, 76?
Neal, how old are you?
No, O'Neal.
O'Neal. Yeah. Oh,
Neal,
I
you
gotta think that, he's probably in that realm. Yeah.
Yeah. But he just retired, right?
Yeah. I think what, 2020, I think was 2018.
Yeah.
In the last 2 or 3 years, it was over COVID, I know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No, I didn't mean you were 75.
Not quite. Some days I feel like it. Doing better.
But we're in a facility that's it's called ACTS Life Communities, and it's the full gamut. You have your independent living, and then you got a couple restaurants. One, they never have enough people to open since COVID, but you've got the long-term care. You have assisted care. You have memory unit. So it's kind of a one-stop shop. And what we did is, if your apartment had been lived in 4 years, you can take out walls, do anything you want to do. So we just designed an apartment that, we could live in for the rest of. And my wife told me, when I forget who's boss, she's going to put me in the memory unit. So.
But you guys still around Landrum, or where are you guys at now?
Well, we're in Columbus, North Carolina, which is just the one exit north of Landrum. So, it's close. Hey, were you, when Ball State played Clemson, were you down when we were at the Commerce Club? I know it was Gora. Who was the president then? The lady?
Yeah, it would have been, Joanne Gora. Yeah. I was not on that trip.
Were you on that trip?
I was not on that trip. Sean was there.
Oh, okay. Because I know the coach and a lot of the staff came up to the Commerce Club that night for, it was basically heavy hors d'oeuvres and stuff. And then I didn't realize, my gosh, there's tons of Ball State people in the Greenville, Spartanburg area that were there that night. There must have been 300-400 people. So, but that was a fun night too. So, but other than that, I don't know what else I can enlighten you guys with.
No.
Well, I've got one to tie you guys together, Mark. You've already alluded and talked a little bit about your background growing up as a farmer, and you and Troy, John Falstick, and a few others share that background. And I've always been a little envious of that, watching Troy, and I know you did the same thing, and John the same. But just the way you grew up, and you had to fix things when things broke. You didn't have a lot of places to go. You had to figure things out, and you just, as I like to call it, you MacGyvered it, and you just figured out how to do things. And I've always been a little envious of that. I just think it's so awesome the way you guys can do that. But I think about you two and John a lot, and the tie-in, and how you grew up, farming and just learning how to do things and make things happen, and just taking that practical application and putting it to your athletic training know-how, and just doing some great things.
Well, it's been fun. And like I said, just the tie-in to Ball State through, Dick and Sendre and all those guys, it's it's been a blessing.
Yeah, the story I tell, and I've told Neal this story several times, but when I was applying for my internship with the Eagles in 1991, Rex is talking to me about this, and I didn't really understand the connection JD and Hoove and those guys had with Otho, but so I'm writing this letter and I put in there that I grew up on a dairy farm, so I'm not afraid to get up early and go to work and we'd work all day and all this other stuff. And Rex had said, put that stuff in there. That's good stuff. And so I put that in the letter. So I get the internship and we're in London, England for the American Bowl. And we're sitting around dinner and we're on this table and it's the team physicians and there's 10 interns and Otho and Dave and Dave Price and so we've had our meal and we're diving into this after dinner liqueur that Otho they brought it out on this tray and we're out there pouring drinks and shots and whatnot. And so Otho decides to go around the table and tell us why he hired us as interns. And like my roommate, he was like a nephew to Dick Vermeil or something like that.
Oh, okay.
And he gets to me and he goes, well, Troy, I hired you because I read in your letter you grew up on a farm and you'd probably shoveled a lot of shit in your day. And therefore, I figured you'd do just about anything. And I think wasn't like you were this great student athletic trainer. We got this great recommendation from Ball State. No, you just shoveled a lot of shit, and that's why I wanted to hire you. So, and Otho, he smiled. He had that little wry smile as he said it.
Yeah, that's exactly.
And so I came back and told JD that, and he just started laughing. He goes, "That's a compliment. You should go with that."
But no, it's been real. It's been real.
Yeah. It's gone off the roll with Mark Pfeil.
Well, that was awesome. And sorry, in the intro, I failed to mention that we had a special guest co-host, Neal Hazen, with us on this podcast today. And I really appreciate Neal coming on and kind of joining us in talking to Mark. And Mark and Neal have known each other for a while as well. So it helped having Neal around to kind of provoke some memories as well. And a shout out to Beth Pfeil for Mark's wife for getting all the technical stuff set up for us so we could get the podcast done. So it was awesome to have everybody on. It was a great time, a great conversation. And like I said, Mark has an amazing story to tell about his experiences and what he's doing now in his volunteer work with Beth. So we want to thank Mark and Beth for coming on, and Neal too. So if you have any feedback, you can get to us on offtherollpodcast@gmail.com. You can reach out to me on my personal Facebook page, and then off the roll pod on Twitter is our own Twitter account that we're doing this as well. So we got lots of avenues for feedback. Please don't hesitate to do that. And we will hopefully be setting up a new podcast here in the next couple of weeks. Like I said, we've got some exciting guests that are not necessarily Ball State connected, athlete training connected, but have some amazing stories to tell about athletic training or related to athlete training and doing that. And I'm really, really looking forward to connecting with those people on those episodes. So hope everybody has a great day and take care.